couple of things that sort of I think link what we've heard to date with the session coming up. At the movie yesterday, one of the speakers referenced the notion of Ubuntu, which I've always thought was, I am. The essence of that is I am because we are. So, in a sense, this next session is about the we. We've heard a lot about the sort of personal health impacts of loneliness and social isolation. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how the community works. And we sort of hinted at that. And one of the things that I found particularly interesting was a couple of speakers mentioning the link between loneliness and extremism. That when you have a high level of loneliness in society, people are often driven to groups that are advocating quite, sort of fringe beliefs. So it's great to have with us Kwame McKenzie, who's the professor of psychiatry at the U of T and the CEO of the Wellesley Institute. He's spent decades researching the power of social connection at the community level, and his session is entitled "Connected We Stand, Divided We Fall." So great to have you with us, Kwame.
Thanks very much, John. And I wanted to, if we could have the presentation up, that would be wonderful. I wanted to start by thanking Pete for his tireless focus on the issue, and also you, John, for the introduction. And also all the speakers and the presentations and everybody who's joined, because it's great. People often forget that they're making history with this social connections, human connections conference. And, it's wonderful that this is now a thing as opposed to an idea. Now, you will have heard about the importance of connection for the individual and for individual resilience. I'm a psychiatrist, and so it's important to me. Next, now, can I move these slides myself? Yes, I can. Wonderful. And research shows, so I'm important in connection at an individual level, and research says there are 5 things we need to build our mental resilience and stay happy. And what you're seeing on this slide is the 5 a day that you need for heart health, so 5 bits of fruit and vegetable a day. But then the 5 a day you need for positive mental health. And those 5 things, the top of the list is connection. Yeah, so it's connect, be active, be aware, which is mindfulness, get involved, and give. Those are the big 5 things that you need to build mental resilience. And when they talk about connection, in this case, the best way of staying connected is by meeting people. It works better than text. It works better than anti-social media. And it works better than even this, which is Zoom. Face-to-face works better. But as John said, that's not what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about something completely different. Now, I spend a lot of time talking to people in poverty and to racialized groups in Canada. And they're worried about obviously existing inequalities and hardships, but also the things that are coming. They're worried about the continuing COVID pandemic. They're worried about affordability, and they're not worried about the looming recession. But one of the things that comes up over and over again is the fact that they feel disconnected from society, and they feel left behind and even betrayed by government. And so this is where we start getting support for the convoy, for nationalist thinking, for racism, for the anti-vax and conspiracy theories. And they're fertile ground because of this growing narrative that people are disconnected, no one cares. And as John said, and others have said, this is an opportunity for extremism. And politically, we see opportunists using this for populist platforms, and this can be further divisive. And I worry about the divisiveness because as anybody who's ever been in any sort of competition, you know that divided teams never win. And if you have a divided society, that leads to an increase in human suffering. And these divisive politics are the harvest of social changes and a narrative which has been growing for a long time. And the question that I'm asking is, could human connections be the key to doing something about it? So I want to think about whether human connections could be an important tool in helping us in this bigger societal issues. And I want to think about whether human connectedness could lead to increased collectivism. I'm going to start with some data. And we're going to see a few bits of data as we're talking about moving from the individual and family impacts of human connection to the impacts on society. And I'm going to talk by talking about inequality. Now, what we've got in front of us here is a measure of inequality, which is called the Gini coefficient. A zero Gini coefficient means that you have perfect equality, and a Gini coefficient of 1 means that you have perfect inequality. And this is looking across the world. This is looking at countries across the world and looking at the Gini coefficient. And the thing just to think about is the world is less equal now than it was 200 years ago. So 200 years ago, the world was more equal than it is now. So at a time where there were big colonial powers, where there was much more feudal societies, well, actually, the world itself was more equal than it is now. And there are some things, this doesn't go as far back, but start thinking from 1960s onwards in Canada, we have seen tremendous growth. And you can see this is the gross domestic product per person in Canada. And this has grown significantly over time, and it's still growing. We've had a little bit of a turn down, but actually we're still much richer per person than we ever were in Canada. The problem is that the wealth hasn't been shared. So what you've got here is the green at the top is the share of the highest 10% of the population, which has gone up in real terms since 1981. But the share of the lowest 20% and the lowest 10% haven't gone up, despite the fact that we have got so much richer since 1981. And because of that, when you look at Canada's Gini coefficient, it was actually quite low in 1991, down getting towards 3, and now it's now going up to 3.5. And a Gini coefficient of 3 has minimal impacts on health, but for every little point you get above 3, you get more impacts on health and of inequality. And the reason why we have a growing inequality in Canada is because we are doing less. We are doing less redistribution of taxes. So what you see here is 2 lines. The line at the top is the Gini coefficient, so the measure of equality, if we just use people's actual earnings. And if you just use people's earnings, you can see from 1976 up to 2015, we have quite a high Gini coefficient of over 4 in Canada, which will have really big impacts on health. But the red line is what the Gini coefficient is after tax. So after tax and other redistribution. And so back in 1976, the Gini coefficient after tax was under 3. And we go all the way through to about the early 90s, and then things start to change. Wages go up hugely, taxes don't go up at the same level, and our Gini coefficient rises. So what you're seeing in that red line is government policies that actually were protecting people and decreasing inequality. But from the 90s onwards in Canada, those government policies and that tax buffering was relaxed. And so we've become more and more unequal over time. But that's not the whole problem. Not only have we become more unequal in Canada over time, but we've also been spending less on things that will make us more equal. So what this is looking at the Canada government spend on education as a percentage of GDP over time. And from an 8% spend on education in 1971, we've come down to a 5% spend on education by 2011, and it's continued to decrease. So what we're finding is Canada is becoming more unequal, but on top of it, people are losing confidence in collective movements that work towards equality. So union membership has gone down in Canada at the same time. So it looks difficult. Canada's becoming more unequal and more disconnected economically and geographically. And what I mean by geographically is this sort of analysis that we have seen in Toronto. This is by David Helchansky, a professor of sociology in University of Toronto, and he's been looking at what's been happening over 35 years. He's actually taken the data further, but we'll just look for this 35 years and how Toronto has changed. And what he says is Toronto isn't one city. Toronto is three cities. City 1, incomes in real terms have increased significantly. In City 2, incomes have stayed pretty much the same. And in City 3, incomes have decreased. So instead of there being one city, there are three cities with different trajectories. City 1 getting richer, City 2 flatlining, City 3 getting poorer. But one other thing's happening, and if I were to show you the picture of 2015, one of the things that's happening is that City 2 is disappearing. City 1's getting bigger, but not much bigger. City 3 is getting much, much bigger, and City 2 is disappearing. And so what we're getting is much more income polarity. In 2005 terms, in 1970, 66% of Toronto neighborhoods were middle income. By 2005, that has halved. In 1970, the proportion of low-income neighborhoods was 20%. That's now gone up to 53%. And after tax, the individual income in City 1 in 2005 was $26,900 and was 3 times that high in City 1. So we've got income polarity. But one of the things that we have to think about when we're thinking about these things is just not these figures, it is what it does to us. So sometimes when I show this, what I ask people is, what was the first thing you thought when you saw this map? And the first thing that some people say they thought was, where's my house? So they wanted to know whether they're in City 1, City 2, or City 3. And that's normally what people do. But the next stage is that people in city 3 are thinking, how do I get into city 2? And people in city 2 are thinking how they get into city 1. And what happens is people with the skills that allow them to be mobile, and a lot of those people are the people who end up being most powerful, concentrate in city 1. So what's happened in Toronto is that power, resources, access to resources, and the development of the sort of social policy has now concentrated in city 1, and city 1 is less connected to city 2 and city 3. Everything you need is in city 1. If you have the right money, there's no need to go to city 2 and city 3, and policies focus on city 1, not city 2 or city 3. So there's a lack of connectedness, and that's what happens. Now, they have been having the same questions in the States, but they've got some really interesting data and some really interesting hypotheses as to what's going on. And this work has been popularized by Professor Robert Putnam, who's a professor at Harvard, who also was a person who he advised both Clintons and is a very well-known policy developer. And he has been looking at what's been happening over a longer period in the States. Now, he's while I was looking at the rise in inequality, he's looking at equality, which is why the curves are the different way up. But he's got lovely data from 1900 onwards, and looking at the trends in equality in the United States. And the trends in equality in the United States go up until the 60s, plateau between 60s and the 80s. But then just after the 1980s, when Reagan came in and others, it comes down severely. And we've had increasing inequality or decreasing equality in the United States. And it's a very similar curve for union membership. Goes up until the 60s, plateaus, and then starts coming down. And if you're looking at cross-party collaboration, which is a measure of a lack of divisiveness, of a lack of political divisiveness, very similar. Goes up to about the 30s and then continues to plateau up until the 1980s, and then it goes down. So this idea of people being disconnected, people being alienated, there being increases in inequities are things that are seen south of the border and north of the border. But south of the border, they're starting to say why. Now, Putnam's taking a slightly different perspective. He's interested in his book, which is called The Upswing, in what, inverted commas, made America great, because he thinks that's what will make them great again. And when he's looking at what's gone wrong, he's talking about, is it something to do with the end of communism? Is it to do with decreased religious affiliation? Could it be the success of materialism? Could it be Freudian psychology, which is very much about me rather than we? Postmodernism, more choice from a neoliberal perspective, the rise of multinationals, it could be all of them. But he's very interested in whether it could be because of decreased social capital and what we talked about previously, or has been talked about previously, increasing loneliness and isolated living. And some of the reason he's interested in this is because of graphs like this. This is one measure of social capital, which is philanthropy. How much people are willing to give free to help others. And this is a US trend in philanthropy. And one of the interesting things about the trend in philanthropy is it decreases before many of these other changes, the political changes, the union changes. This change in philanthropy or social capital seems to have changed and then leads to these other changes. And one of the other interesting things that Putnam has done is he's tried to measure social perceptions and a measure that goes with this sort of social capital around how people are thinking about the world. And the way he has done that is by looking at all of the English language publications in the US of A since the 1900s, and simply looked at the trend of the ratio between we and I. And so the more measures of we, the higher the ratio, the more measures of I, the lower the ratio. And you can see that sometime in just after the start of the 1960s, there's a sharp change in the ratio of we and I to where we get today, where when you look at it, I, talking about the individual, not the collective, is much, much, much more common in books than we. And he says, well, what is going on? How did that change? How did we get this change from thinking in sort of collectively growing this collective ideology where we was important to talking about I? And he is a social capital theorist, so not surprisingly, he thinks social capital is important. And social capital is just a way of describing social processes that shape communities, and there are loads of different definitions. The first definitions and the first ideas of social capital came in 1916 from Lyda Hannafin, and the thing that's interesting from our perspective is it was rural community school centres or community centres, and those social connections in community centres that he said was developing goodwill and developing social capital. And Jane Jacobs, in her initial theories of social capital, was talking about this underlying float of the continuity of people who formed neighbourhood networks and connections, which are the city's irreplaceable social capital. And the importance, and then Putnam came along and wrote, popularised it with a wonderful book called Bowling Alone. And Bowling Alone really is documenting what was happening in the States in the 80s and the 90s, when instead of there being bowling leagues where people would go bowling, and I know that people are going bowling later on today if they're in Toronto, where instead of going bowling as a group, which is what's happening today, people were going bowling individually. So individuals and families went out bowling as opposed to these bowling leagues and bowling groups. And this idea of bowling alone rather than, and it being the I rather than the we, is something that a lot of people have got interested in because when they've looked at measures of social capital, connectedness, trust, the number of these groups that are out there that connect people, it's sort of quite predictive of what's happening in society. Lower levels of social capital, increased mortality, increased illness, increased crime, increased drugs use. Whereas if there's high connections, high social capital, it actually increases the life expectancy, governments work better, there's more funding for the social safety net, and there's higher educational achievement. So people are really interested in social capital. But there are lots of different types of social capital. For instance, there's the social capital that makes us think that we might work for others, and that's called cognitive social capital. There's the social capital that comes from investing in things like health services, that's called structural social capital. And then there's bonding social capital, the social capital which bonds families together, and bridging social capital, the social capital which bridges together these bonded groups. And then lastly, those groups can be bridged horizontally, so people in the same social class, or vertically, where people from one class are linked to people in other classes, which gets them access to resources. And it turns out that though social capital is linked to health and social capital is linked to mental health, it's the bridging social capital, the ties between groups, and the vertical social capital, the ties that link one group to another group, that actually mean that we have a connected community, that are most important for health. Social capital is built by human connection and human association, and it makes a huge difference to the way society can function. So what I was hoping to do today with all of this is to start a conversation. It's to start a conversation about whether based on Putnam's book, The Upswing, which focuses on how America became great and how it can dig itself out of the current problems, and then thinking about social capital, thinking about social and human connections, and starting a conversation about whether one of the key sources of developing a less divisive and therefore a more functional and a better Canada is to start making sure people are connected not just to family and friends, but also connected across social divides, and whether that human connection is not only good for individual health, individual mental health, but social and societal health, and whether this is necessary. This is a necessary thing that we have to do to dig ourselves out of what looks like a divided society, which is struggling both south of the border and north of the border. And so I wanted to finish with a poem. This is a very young-looking Muhammad Ali, who when he was at the top of his game was, and this links to Robert Putnam, he was invited to Harvard to give a lecture. Now, some people were skeptical about he used poems and puns and everything to grow his fame as well as his boxing. And so he was given very short notice and told, as part of his talk at Harvard, he needed to write a poem. And because he was given short notice, he wrote something that's considered one of the shortest poems in the world. And it's very simple: me, we. And I think that might be something we need to think about. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kwame. That was great. A really different perspective from what we've heard from our other speakers. I say where their focus has been more on individual health. One question I have for you. I mean, it seemed, a couple of speakers have mentioned that, and it's always a mystery to me that the UK would have a minister of loneliness of all places. That you think they would, being British, I find that kind of a little strange. But you can maybe comment on that if you want. I mean, this is a challenge of such a scale that it requires government to act. I would say, why isn't the government here taking this more seriously?
It's an interesting thing, as you say, that I always laugh that the Ministry of Loneliness in the UK was actually the smallest ministry there was, and I don't know whether there was anybody apart from the minister. But one of the things about this idea of loneliness, social connection, and social capital is that actually in the 60s and the 70s, a lot of governments were interested in building social connections and human connections, but they were looking at human networks, and they thought a better networked society would work better. But they didn't know how to form those connections, how to get people to form them, and so most government policies didn't work. When Putnam came along in the 90s and started talking about human connections, and what that could do, and social capital. There were two people involved, well, three people. Clinton said, yes, please, we need to do this, and started rolling social capital into policies. Margaret Thatcher was still involved in government in the UK, and she said, I don't think so. But then when Tony Blair came into power, he started putting many more programs that included social connectedness and social capital into government. And what you can see from the social research in the UK and all of the various surveys that there have been is that trust and connections decreased significantly in the Thatcher era in the UK. And then once Blair had put social capital on the agenda, both trust and human and social connections increased in the UK. So there was actually, before it came, you went back to a Conservative government, and it's amazing that they've got their first African, Indian, American Prime Minister in the UK.
Yes, so it's quite, yeah. Oh.
Yeah, that they that there has been government, that there has been government action, but it's got shelved a little bit because of monetary policy.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I'm sort of thinking of as you're sort of painting this picture for us, and this sense that. I know we talked a little bit about belonging and what attracts people to certain groups, that we tend to gravitate towards people who are like us, right? Whoever we are. And I think Martin Luther King said that, America was never so divided as it is on a Sunday, because there are black churches and white churches. And it's this, the one place where people, and it's true of neighborhoods, it's true of leisure activities as well, to some extent. It seems that the one place where people do meet people who are different to themselves tends to be in the workplace. I mean, is there a role for business in this, in making the kind of transformation that you'd like to see?
I think it's a great question and a great perspective. And yes, I do think that there is a role for business in thinking about what type of society it wants to be a part of. And if business wanted to be more effective, it would be a less divisive society. For some businesses, for others not so much. So in more collective societies, or societies with higher levels of social capital, the advertising industry doesn't work as well. So if you go to the Scandinavian countries, advertising doesn't work as well because social values are social values. The more divisive a society is and the less connected people are, the
Yes.
easier it is to sell people things they don't need, because people are looking for value and people are looking for things that make them happy. And you're able to convince people who are not connected that a Tesla is actually going to make you happy. Yeah. Or that a muffin is going to make you happy, or having a mani-pedi is actually going to revolutionize your life, right? You can convince people of that in easier in a less connected societies, according to the research.
There was a thing in the movie last night where someone talked about capitalism and it having to be capitalism. Our capitalism is all about money, whereas capitalism should be about capital more broadly. It talks about sort of natural capital, social capital, and there are another couple of kinds. I can't recall quite what they were.
There's human capital, social capital, natural
human capital is one. That's yes. Yeah.
So I mean, and it's interesting. It sounds like we're going back to a class on Marx, because obviously when they were thinking about capital in the first place, sort of the financial capital was just a part of the whole world of capital, and there was a much less reductionist and a more considered way of thinking about how you create a world. And isn't it interesting looking at those American graphs?
Yes.
That when people were taking a wider view and a less purely monetarist view, that society seemed to be getting better on various different ways. And it's not saying there's no room for capitalism. It's more, what is the room for a connected balance of thinking about what you want from the world? Because, money isn't everything.
And it's interesting how the sort of protectors of the status quo use the label of communism to sort of smear their opponents. But Kiefer makes a point here: that the link between neoliberalism and health, and how anti-government beliefs, really to a reduction of social trust and higher loneliness. So you'd agree with that, presumably?
Well, I think that siloing people leads to problems, and yes, can lead to loneliness and various other things. But it is interesting that when you're looking at a lot of the things that are happening, it's actually the pursuit of connection, the pursuit of human connection, which is what attracts people to things. So whether it's attracting people to sort of extremist groups, whether it's right-wing groups, whether in Canada it's a convoy, it's the feeling of being left out. It's the feeling of being disconnected and the need to connect, which is what's driving a lot of things. And so, yes, on one side there's the loneliness, but on the other side, loneliness is a passion for connection, right?
Yes.
So it's you can flip it.
So Jamie's made a comment here in the chat here. We talked about government, business. I made a reference to Martin Luther King and the churches being actually divided on that Sunday, and they're wondering whether in the light of Putnam's book, The Upswing, the potential role of faith groups in changing the loneliness narrative.
Yeah, and I think that there is always a potential role of faith groups, but we just have to be a little bit careful on terminology. Religion and religious groups tend to be organized and networked. One of the big things that's happened as religion has gone down is spirituality, and individual spirituality has gone up, right? So it depends what type of faith group, what type of religious group, and whether the religious group is about me, and my, and my ascension to being a higher being, or whether it's about we and what we're going to do as a community, how we're connecting as community. And so I think they're different things.
Okay, with that, I feel once again we've run out of time. So thank you very much, Kwame. That was great, and I think, like I say, just expanding our thinking around this issue to beyond just those sort of individual interactions to how that plays out on, in what is, I think many people feel, we're at a critical point in terms of our societies this time, and your wisdom and insight is of huge value. So, and I understand you're going to be at the Lob for some bowling tonight.
I'm hoping to be at the Lob. I've got some. If the energy allows, I will be at the Lob, most definitely.
All right. Well, I won't be, but if you get there, I'm sure you'll have a great time networking and meeting a lot of these great people who attend this event. So thank you very much, Kwame. Appreciate it.
Thanks very much.